I'm Steph. I'm the director of Healthy UNCG. What I was saying behind the muted screen there was that we're really excited to have Amber Reed with us to begin this Food and Mood series in partnership with UNCG Health Coaching Programs and Healthy UNCG. So, what this series will be, it'll be a series that will start again today. We'll have 2 sessions this semester, and it'll continue on through next semester with 4 or 5 sessions that you'll see starting in January. Today starts the series where we'll be talking about, or Amber will be talking about, the food cycle and the cravings we might have, the science behind it. And so we're really fortunate to have Amber with us as part of the UNCG team. She's one of our health coaches. She also, she's a nationally board certified health coach, I should say. She also owns her own consulting company, Balanced Energies. Many of you have probably already visited that website. If not, I always send information on how to contact her in the follow-up email that we send out after the programs. And then she also is a qualified mental health professional. She's a nutrition educator, just a long list of certifications that come with Amber. So I'll let Amber go ahead and get started, tell you all a little bit more about herself. And thanks for being with us, everyone.
Thanks, Steph. I am thrilled to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my screen, and I don't know really what else to add to my introduction. But let's see. There we go. Okay, so basically, just like Steph said, all of the above. I'm a certified health and wellness coach. I do own Balanced Energies. I'm a certified nutrition and wellness educator, as well as a qualified mental health professional. And really, all of that's just a fancy way of saying that food and mood is one of my favorite topics. So enough about me. I really want to go ahead and get started because I'm so excited about our topic today. So we are going to be talking about food and mood. And that connection that we're going to be talking about today is that sugar connection. And like Steph said, we will be food cravings and really the science behind it. This is going to help to lay that groundwork for what we are going to be doing at the first part of November, if I remember correctly. Maybe is it the 9th, Steph, maybe, for part 2, and then going into obviously next semester we have more food and mood things planned, where we'll dive deeper into the gut-brain axis, what that means in terms of, we'll get into sleep and inflammation and a lot of other topics. So Steph, if you want to go ahead and cue the poll for me, I want to get an idea of where everyone is coming from this morning. So just a real quick question about, what do you crave? Okay. So I think the majority of us have answered at this point. It looks like we're thinking about some combination of the above foods being 64%, and then those sugary foods coming in, I won't even say a close second because the combination blew it out of the water, but about a quarter of you specifically mentioned those sugary foods. So what does all this mean? Why do we have these cravings? What controls our appetite? These are some of the things we're going to get into. But to set the basis, we need to really understand why all this is important. Why is nutrition important? And when we think about mental health specifically, nutrition is actually a pretty valuable piece of the puzzle, and it's often overlooked. And there are 4 main reasons that you want to consider nutrition in mental health recovery, specifically if you're looking at even stress conditions, but depression or anxiety, or a lot of those things that many of us have experienced with COVID. So Nutrition helps to replete key vitamin and mineral deficiencies. And this includes, it can include when we're thinking about how these things become depleted, there are lots of things that can deplete these. One, our soil is not as nutritious as it once was to grow those foods, but also drugs, prescription drugs can pull these things away as we process them out. Alcohol, all these ultra processed foods, we can actually use up our stores of vitamins and minerals to process these things out. So thinking about how nutrition can give us those things back. And then nutrition can also help us build resiliency to buffer stress. So thinking about trauma, natural disaster type of things, pandemic. Some studies were done several years ago now that looked at how supplementing with high dose micronutrients, those vitamins and minerals, were actually able to reduce the stress that people experienced in terms of that trauma. So I feel like that was a good thing to include considering where we're all coming from after the last year and a half. Okay. Nutrition is also important because obviously it's going to help to repair and rebuild any tissues or pathways that may become compromised. We're going to look at the appetite regulation, what controls it, and some of those food cravings. And really what's happening is that there is a dysregulation within these pathways. So proper nutrition can actually help to rebuild and repair some of these things. And it can also help to decrease relapse risk. That could be relapse for burnout, for stress, for depression, for anxiety. So I'll let you kind of fill in the blank there. So nutrition is very important. That's the ultimate takeaway from that. There are a couple of key terms that we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk about a lot more than this, but I want to just give you a background of where we're going. First of all, what is food craving versus food addiction? I think most of you are probably aware of this, but I want to make sure. A food craving, although it is intense, or an intense urge, let's say, for that desired food, food addiction is even more intense. And it often tends to be hijacking that impulse control, and it can be chronic, in turn lead to those changes in the brain itself. So the idea here is that reinforcing food cravings over and over can actually lead to those food addictions. Now, when we look, I've included basically on here some of the neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, simply because when we're talking about mood, that's what many people think of. And indeed, they do have a role to play, not only in how we're feeling in our brain chemistry, but also in appetite regulation and metabolism. So some things that we don't often think about. But just to give you a brief overview, if we look at serotonin, serotonin is one of the main targets of our antidepressant drugs, right? But it's also associated with those emotions, typically with bringing about feelings of happiness or well-being. And it's been shown to have an anti-inflammatory effect, which goes along with the idea that inflammation may be a driver of mental health conditions themselves. Okay, so thinking about this serotonin, this is often what we are hitting on when we talk about comfort foods. Okay, so many of you probably dove headfirst into comfort foods with the pandemic. I know I certainly did. It made me feel better, right? That's because part of what that's doing, especially with those high carbohydrate foods, is really hitting on that serotonin. What we don't often hear about, though, is that it's often hitting on dopamine as well as GABA as well. So that's why those are on there. Dopamine is really associated with that reward and pleasure system. But more than that, dopamine is what motivates us to seek food or to seek out other things that make us happy. And so it actually helps to regulate appetite and metabolism, along with a lot of other hormones, like that serotonin. And it has been linked to addiction to substances as well as food cravings. And that is because it activates those pleasure reward centers. So when you hear me talk about these high foods that we're going to talk about, that high fat, high sugar, high salt combination, that's hitting on that dopamine circuitry. Okay. Now, endorphins, many of you may have heard of endorphins in terms of exercise. And indeed, a lot of endorphins are typically released with exercise. This is what for a long time we thought was solely responsible for that runner's high. Turns out it's only partially responsible. There are other things at play here. But endorphins help to modulate pain. And so it's really good to have that released in times of stress, right? If we're running from a tiger and we happen to step on a rock, we don't necessarily want to feel stepping on the rock. We want to keep running from the tiger. So endorphins actually really help with that pain management. Okay. And foods can help to mimic these things. Specifically, endorphins are what hit on those opioid receptors in the brain, and foods like gluten, like wheat, pasta, bread, and milk products, the casein in there actually bonds to those opioid receptors, which can make them even more addictive. We know how addictive opioids are. And so when foods act in the same ways, they can definitely become addictive as well. And then GABA is like the break. So if all of these kind of make you feel better, get you going, GABA comes along and it says, okay, but now it's time to relax and be calm. And so that's what GABA does. And there's thought that low GABA actually contributes to substance use disorders as well as food cravings and addictions. So many medications that target GABA are the ones that we use for anxiety. So a lot of your benzos and muscle relaxers will hit on GABA. And then there's lots more. You'll hear about ghrelin and leptin, as well as insulin and things of that like that as we move on. So I hope this is not too much information, but I do want to give you an overview of where we're going. So what I want to show you next is actually a video about what controls appetite. It's just over 4 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, and it goes into the science, but it really helps to lay the foundation for why we're going to implement some of the strategies that we are coming up in part 2. So
hunger claws at your grumbling belly. It tugs at your intestines, which begin to writhe, aching to be fed. Being hungry generates a powerful, often unpleasant, physical sensation that's almost impossible to ignore. After you've reacted by gorging on your morning pancakes, you start to experience an opposing force, fullness. But how does your body actually know when you're full? The sensation of fullness is set in motion as food moves from your mouth down your esophagus. Once it hits your stomach, it gradually fills the space. That causes the surrounding muscular wall to stretch, expanding slowly like a balloon. A multitude of nerves wrapped intricately around the stomach wall sense the stretching. They communicate with the vagus nerve, up to the brainstem and hypothalamus, the main parts of the brain that control food intake. But that's just one input your brain uses to sense fullness. After all, if you fill your stomach with water, you won't feel full for long. Your brain also takes into account chemical messengers in the form of hormones produced by endocrine cells throughout your digestive system. These respond to the presence of specific nutrients in your gut and bloodstream, which gradually increase as you digest your food. As the hormones seep out, they're swept up by the blood and eventually reach the hypothalamus in the brain. Over 20 gastrointestinal hormones are involved in moderating our appetites. One example is cholecystokinin, which is produced in response to food by cells in the upper small bowel. When it reaches the hypothalamus, it causes a reduction in the feeling of reward you get when you eat food. When that occurs, the sense of being satiated starts to sink in, and you stop eating. Cholecystokinin also slows down the movement of food from the stomach into the intestines. That makes your stomach stretch more over a period of time, allowing your body to register that you're filling up. This seems to be why, when you eat slowly, you actually feel fuller compared to when you consume your food at lightning speed. When you eat quickly, your body doesn't have time to recognize the state it's in. Once nutrients and gastrointestinal hormones are present in the blood, they trigger the pancreas to release insulin. Insulin stimulates the body's fat cells to make another hormone called leptin. Leptin reacts with receptors on neuron populations in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has two sets of neurons important for our feeling of hunger. One set produces the sensation of hunger by making and releasing certain proteins. The other set inhibits hunger through its own set of compounds. Leptin inhibits the hypothalamus neurons that drive food intake and stimulates the neurons that suppress it. By this point, your body has reached peak fullness. Through the constant exchange of information between hormones, the vagus nerve, the brainstem, and the different portions of hypothalamus, your brain gets the signal that you've eaten enough. Researchers have discovered that some foods produce more long-lasting fullness than others. For instance, boiled potatoes are ranked as some of the most hunger-satisfying foods, while croissants are particularly unsatisfying. In general, foods with more protein, fiber, and water tend to keep hunger at bay for longer. But feeling full won't last forever. After a few hours, your gut and brain begin their conversation again. Your empty stomach produces other hormones, such as ghrelin, that increase the activity of the hunger-causing nerve cells in the hypothalamus. Eventually, the growling beast of hunger is reawakened. Luckily, there's a dependable antidote for that. This video is made possible by our community on Patreon. And if you're curious about health and nutrition, check out this playlist.
Okay, waiting to make sure I didn't accidentally cue the other video. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate, I know that was a lot of science, but it comes down to that there are certain cues that control whether we're feeling hungry or whether we're feeling full. And it's a very complex system, and there are lots of different pathways that come in to that hypothalamus, which ultimately helps to regulate those feeding behaviors. So it did specifically mention cholecystokinin, which, for sake of presentation, we're going to call that CCK. That's often what it's referred to as. But CCK typically, like it said, reduces appetite because it makes you feel full. It slows food coming out of the stomach. It releases digestive enzymes. This is typically what it does. But what they are finding, because this is going to be relevant as we go through the presentation, is that emulsifiers in ultra-processed foods actually impact its release. So the more of these highly processed, ultra-processed foods we are consuming, the more damage we are doing to the regulatory mechanisms that are partially responsible for this appetite control. All right. And so we can actually lose our ability then to know when we're full, to have these digestive enzymes secreted, and it can actually lead to gut changes. All right. So the other thing I wanted to point out was that ghrelin, it talked about ghrelin. I think about ghrelin as a gremlin. You know, gremlins I think about having that voracious appetite, wanting to eat all the time. And that's really what ghrelin does. It makes us hungry. It makes us want to eat. But ghrelin also learns your patterns. So ghrelin can actually be released in anticipation of it being time for you to eat. So if we eat at 8, 12, and 6, then ghrelin learns that cycle, and it can actually be released, and you will start to feel your stomach get hungry. You'll start getting those cues anytime it approaches those times. And so thinking about that, we'll talk about that with strategies as well when we get to part two, but I want to make sure you had that basis so that you understand where I'm going with this. So with all of this being said, neurotransmitters can actually impact our cravings. They impact that reward circuitry and our food-seeking behaviors. And part of this, again, is regulated through that appetite control that we just learned about. So the link between food, mood, and addiction is actually quite strong, right? Food can be used as that replacement high or mood enhancement, like we've just talked about. And this can be due to those physiological factors or to the mental and emotional attachments that we make with food itself. So when we're thinking about those mental and emotional sort of attachments we make with food, and if y'all want to add in the chat, this would be a great place to do it. How many of you actually find comfort foods? You have certain comfort foods that you go to, they make you feel warm and fuzzy, they remind you of a happy time in your life. If you'd like to share those in the chat, feel free to do so. There are a lot of foods that I have that unfortunately I can't eat anymore for other reasons, but I remember home cooked meals at my grandmother's house. I remember some of her cakes and cookies that she would bake. And so, you know, every time I smell those smells or I get those tastes, I'm reminded of those good things. And we know that those mental and emotional attachments can impact our physiology as well. So, Steph, I don't know if anyone put anything in the chat, but if they did and you'd like to share some of those.
Yeah. Funny, this is right at lunchtime too. But we have butter noodles, chocolate, mac and cheese, baked goods, chicken and dumpling. Again, lots of baked, like cake, cookies, lots of chocolate, lots of mac and cheese. And then someone mentioned even just smells of, trying to find that comment in here. But someone had mentioned just the smell of vanilla cooking to comfort.
Yeah, we know too, just kind of as an aside, smell does impact our appetite, right? But smell goes directly into those olfactory receptors. And so we know that smells can impact our mood as well. This can be a really good thing. It can take us back to positive memories, but it could also be a really negative thing if that smell takes us back to something that's traumatic or, you know, maybe not safe for us. So yeah, very, very good comments. Lots of those comfort foods. I miss chicken and dumplings so much. All right, let me make sure. There we go. Okay. So if we look specifically at the food addiction cycle, really what we're talking about, and I have two graphics, they basically say the same thing, but if I can stay on there, one does it in more of the word picture, one does it in more of actually images. So hoping that this rings bells for my different types of learners in here. But the idea is that you have this stressor, right, that comes in, whatever it happens to be. You're running late for work, or the dog pooped in the house, or, you know, your kid wouldn't get dressed to go to school and now you're running behind, whatever it happens to be, or it's a pandemic and it's a major stressor, right? But it comes in. This causes cortisol to be released. Well, we figured out that, hey, guess what? We can shut down these feelings of anxiety, of stress, if we eat something. So we eat those high fat, high sugar, high salt foods, right? We get that serotonin, that dopamine, even that GABA release, and then we feel that temporary relief. When that wears off, you know, there may be some guilt associated with it, and then that guilt serves as a stressor. And so we get caught in that cycle. But it can also be too that we attach, like I said, meaning to that experience, you know, and we want to eat foods that remind us of happy times, especially when we're in places where we're not feeling so happy, you know. So thinking about how you get on that hamster wheel, and then what keeps it going. And like I said, part two, we're going to talk about how we can hop off of there. Okay. I can't think of anyone that I've ever met that at some point has not had some sort of food craving or some sort of food addiction on some level. Remember, when we're talking about mental health, it is on a continuum. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone, and we're all moving right along here. So what I really wanted to get y'all to look at, I know we promised that we would go over your craving triggers. Okay, these triggers are the same thing as what are your stressors, right? What is causing you to eat? And so one model that we can use, we use this a lot in health promotion of all forms, but it's the biopsychosocial model. And now they've even the biopsychosocial spiritual model. So thinking about how that relates to these food cravings, these food addictions that we have. We look at the biological aspect. What is it that's going on in our body? Are we low in vitamins and minerals? Is there some sort of microbiome imbalance? Is there some inflammation? Or, we not getting sleep? Or the psychological side, right? These may be our beliefs and attitudes, our coping skills, thinking about those emotions that kind of go along with that eating. And then that social context, a lot of us eat in that social context. We go out, we eat, we meet people for drinks, we may eat, right? So there's a lot of good feelings possibly associated with that idea. And then what does that look like in terms of spirituality? What meanings do you assign to food? Do you pay reverence to where food comes from prior to eating? So there's a lot of different ways that these 4 aspects, I guess, technically, the biopsycho and social and spiritual, can fit into your food cravings. And so that's what I want to get you just to kind of play around with for a little bit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but can you think of examples that might relate to these different areas, whether it's the biological, the psychological, the social, or the spiritual? And I'd like to encourage you to put some of those into the chat box.
And Amber, we already had a few comments that kind of fit in perfectly to that. A few have mentioned problems with boredom as a trigger, or kind of starting that they'll eat when they're bored. So any, thoughts, or will we be getting into advice or strategies on that?
Absolutely. I have a great picture. I was saving it for next time, but it has somebody opening the refrigerator and they've hung a sign coming down so that when it opens, it falls down, you see it, right? It says, "You're bored, shut the damn door." And there is truth to that, right? So we will definitely get into the idea of what we can do, how we catch that ahead of time, and then what we can do with that. We'll get into that more next time for sure.
This isn't necessarily in the chat, but has come up in conversations we've had in similar presentations, I guess, about, and I think maybe it goes into maybe a little bit of family background, but also probably in coping skills. So as a child, maybe if something went wrong at school or you were having a bad day, a parent might take you out for ice cream or, bake cookies. And so I don't know, those to me kind of fall into that social and psychology mix there in that Venn diagram.
Oh, for sure. And probably even some of the spiritual too, right? Because we are assigning that meaning. What is the purpose for us eating these? To feel better when we've had a bad day, right? So there is a lot of overlap with all of these. And that's where that idea of how do we assign meaning to our foods? And then how does that impact those feelings that we have? And so when we go back to those past memories, it most certainly can impact how we feel when we eat certain foods.
There's also some comments in the chat box about just the way we celebrate holidays. A lot of times it's around food and social gathering and that space. One participant mentioned definitely a social she said, I am Turkish, and almost all of our social interaction happens around food. And then also just separately from that, binge snacking as we binge watch TV, mindless eating, using food as rewards, and then craving certain foods when we don't feel well. So all of those were mentioned.
Yeah, good. That means that everyone has a handle on this and they know exactly where we're going with this. The really good part is a lot of those things that you just mentioned, we are going to talk about strategies that directly relate to those in part 2. So I encourage you all to come back for that. We'll get into boredom. We'll talk about mindful eating. We'll talk about halting before we actually put that food in our mouth. What does that look like? We'll practice some tapping, which has been shown to help with those cravings. And we'll also talk about just some novel things. Again, we've kind of laid the science, but I'll bring it back up next time. Getting outside. What in the world would that have to do with appetite? Okay, so a lot of these things we're going to get into more. So hopefully that intrigues you a little bit and you'll come back and join us. So let's look at some of these eating triggers. I've heard a lot of you mention several, and we're gonna look at different aspects. We're gonna break this down into the social, the emotional, the situational, the thinking, and the physiological. And so I'm actually going to give you a chance. I think, let me do a time check here. I think we'll have time to probably run through these quickly. I'm going to send out this worksheet to you. I'll have Steph send it out as a follow-up so that you will have it and you'll be able to do it more on your own. But I want to give you an idea here of how this works so you can start to see. So what I'm going to want you to do is to rate how likely each situation that you see on the next few slides is to trigger you to start eating. Okay. And this is on a scale from very unlikely to very likely. The idea being that if you score above 24 in either any area, then that may be an area that is troublesome for you. Okay. So kind of thinking about your total number, add them up as we go along if you want to do that as well. So if we look specifically at social eating triggers, very quickly, let's look at these. Remember, are you very unlikely to eat or very likely to eat if you are having an argument or a conflict with someone? And just make a note of what your score might be on that one. What about if you are being with others when they are eating? You're out in a restaurant, everyone else is eating. Are you very unlikely or very likely to eat? Or you're being urged to eat by someone else. I read that one and I just kept thinking about the kids not wanting to eat anymore and they're being urged by someone else. So thinking about that. And then feeling inadequate around others. Okay. And then you would add up your scores. And like I said, anything over 24 means that this particular area may be a little troublesome for you. So feel free if you would like, this is very personal kinds of stuff, but if you would like to put your total number in the chat box as we go through these, feel free, and we can definitely discuss those. The worksheet that comes out will have how to interpret these. So if you scored high, this means that you're very susceptible to the influence of others. And so working on ways to more assertively communicate can be helpful, as well as even managing anger. And so here you're going to want to challenge your beliefs about the need to be polite and swallow those emotions and please everyone else, just to make you feel fulfilled in those social situations, and really start listening to those hunger cues or satiety cues. Okay, so that kind of goes along with that social aspect. When we look at emotional eating triggers, if we're looking at these different realms, again, the same sort of thing. Are you very unlikely or very likely? when you are feeling bad, okay, this goes into those emotions. Are you feeling anxious, depressed, sad? Okay. What about if you're feeling good, happy, or relaxed? And here's that boredom. You see that boredom come in. And then what about when you're feeling stressed or excited? And so just again, adding those numbers up, seeing if it's more than 24. And what a high score here suggests is that there may need to be some improvement on those coping skills, those emotional coping skills or self-regulatory skills that help you deal with emotions. Many times we use food to squish the emotions down, right? Especially if those are painful sorts of feelings. So working with ways to release those in a way that is not food-based. So thinking about how that might work for you. And then we have those situational eating triggers, okay? So you see an advertisement for food or eating, maybe while you're watching television, and you're like, oh yeah, I could eat, that looks good, I'm gonna go get it, okay? Are you very likely or very unlikely to do those sorts of behaviors? Or you pass by a bakery or cookie shop, something, you smell the aroma, something catches your eye, entices you to go in. Okay, there's that party or celebration, special occasion. You think about the holiday maybe coming in there, or just eating out in general, being at that restaurant setting with family or friends. And so again, a high score here means that you're especially susceptible to those external sort of influences. And so learning what your cues are can be helpful in these situations so that you can really make a plan of an attack about what you're going to do when these situations come up. And you may want to work on controlling that environment, changing the way that you not only behave around food, but even the way you cook or store kinds of foods. Okay. The idea is to anticipate that problem and make a plan of action. Okay, and we'll work on possibly setting some SMART goals as part 2 comes along as well. So that, again, going back to that planning. So if we look at these thinking eating triggers, this includes things like you're making excuses to yourself about why it's okay to eat. These are all those things that go on in our mind that we tell ourselves, or that we, even neutralize what maybe we know is not what we need to do, but we neutralize it or justify it. Okay. But this also includes really beating yourself up for some sort of body image, or feeling like you're unable to control that eating. Okay. What they're finding is it's really not necessarily a matter of willpower, but these are really strong influences that are coming not just from the brain, right? But these influences are coming from the gut, and they're coming from the gut even when we don't know they're there. So we're going to talk in a minute about hidden sugars, things like that. So those hidden sources of those addictive foods can be hijacking your ability to say no. And food manufacturers know this, right? So again, with this one, is that the way that you talk to yourself, the beliefs you hold, or even your expectations or memory can influence you. Okay.
And Amber, this seems to be a strong one in just the chat. People really resonating with that thinking. So
yeah. It's that stinking thinking is what I like to call it. It gets us in trouble, right? Because sometimes we're our worst enemies, and we do blame ourselves. And it's really a lot deeper than that when we're talking about cravings and addictions. The best way I know how to put it is you can't mind your way out of mind, okay? When you're in these places, thinking about it, whether positively or negatively, is very difficult to actually change. We really have to get in there and do something, get into the body, change the physiology, change our responses and our behaviors. So that thinking, we've kind of been conditioned So we just need to change our thinking, right? And that can be hard to do when we're in the moment, especially when the body systems are overriding that. Okay, so yeah, this is often a big one for a lot of people. And then there's that body piece, that physiological triggers, okay? Are you experiencing pain, discomfort? Maybe you feel like you get shaky when you're hungry, okay? Or maybe you've had too much caffeine, not enough food. Are you feeling like you're tired? Okay, this is where that idea of sleep starts to come in. Sleep actually has a really strong impact on our appetite. And have you ever noticed how when you're really tired, you didn't sleep well, or you're sleep deprived, you tend to want to eat more? Okay, this is because your body's like, I need energy. I'm tired. I need energy. So it actually activates those pathways that say, eat, eat. It helps. It gives us energy. All right. Okay. So thinking about that, and a high score here means that the way you eat, what you eat, or even medications that you're taking may be affecting your eating behavior. And we do know that prescription medications can impact this. We see this a lot with psychiatric medications. They actually can cause weight gain and metabolic disturbances, and they can increase appetite, and some of them can decrease appetite, but there's definitely an interplay with what's going on there. Okay, so thinking about if that's you, what does that look like? And if any of these rang a bell or resonated with you, feel free to reach out to me, let me know, and I will try to make sure if I haven't planned on highlighting it for part 2, that I can add something in there, or bring your questions to part 2 as well. And we can do definitely a deeper dive in this. Okay. So why do we crave certain foods? Sometimes it can be because we're deficient, but the research is really mixed on this. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. For some people, it does appear that it can be a vitamin or mineral deficiency, some sort of micronutrient, because they eat it, they feel better. For other people, this really isn't the case, and there's probably a lot more going on. But you can see there are several assumptions about what your craving might mean in terms of a deficiency, right? And there are lots of different resources online. Here's kind of a chart that consolidates a lot of those different things, but you can see sweets was a big one. Sweets could mean that your body, that physiological piece, that body piece, you got that low blood sugar, all right? But it could also mean low amino acids, like in terms of tryptophan. Tryptophan turns into serotonin. Okay, so if we're deficient in the amino acids that help to regulate these neurotransmitters, then we may have cravings. Okay, so the oily, fatty foods, not a lot of people really said they were craving those, but essential fatty acid deficiency can actually be confused with sweet cravings, because there are cells in our gut that actually pick up on the amount of fatty acids that we're intaking, the amount of sugars we're intaking. And sometimes as these signals can get crossed, especially if, we're eating a lot of the wrong foods and they get dysregulated. So we may have a sweet craving when actually our body is saying, no, I need more protein, or I need more fatty acids of some sort. So again, we will talk about some of these next time. But that gives you an idea. And I'm happy to send this chart out if anyone would like to just look over it in more detail. So basically what we're talking about is, in terms of the main causes of food cravings, I've sort of listed my top 5 on the left there. So you can see stress, emotional unrest. That's where those feelings come into play. Attachment of that meaning to foods, especially paired with that emotional unrest. And then unmet needs, or a lack of something. This could be a vitamin and mineral deficiency possibly, but it could also be unmet needs of feeling safe, feeling secure, feeling content. Okay, those are all basic needs that we need as well. And then gut microbiome imbalances, which we will talk about more when we get to the gut-brain section starting next semester. So if we're looking specifically at those carb cravings, you can see there are several types of things that we've talked about today. You know, we're looking on that dysregulation of that glucose and insulin pathway, dysregulation in that dopamine or other neurotransmitter type of pathway, that HPA axis dysfunction. That's part of the H in HPA is the hypothalamus, which we know helps to regulate food intake now, right? Okay, well, stress directly activates that HPA axis. And so stress, again, back to stress and altering your food intake. But again, poor sleep, things we've mentioned. So hopefully that gives you an idea of things that can cause these food cravings. And again, it's not the lack of willpower that is driving these. It's really a whole host of things. Okay, so what about sugar cravings and alcohol? I'm not going to spend a lot of time necessarily on this, but often when we're trying to stop drinking, if this happens to be anyone listening, your sugar cravings are going to be more intense. And that's because, well, it's stressful to the body. And we know, we just talked about what stress, how it can impact cravings. Drinking, especially chronic drinking, can cause nutrient deficiencies, and then it impairs those neurotransmitter pathways. Okay. So how much sugar do we need? And if we look at the American Heart Association, their recommendations are that no more in terms of sugar, right? For women, no more than 25 grams of sugar a day, which equates to about 6 teaspoons. Okay. And for men, that's a little bit more. Sorry, ladies, we kind of get left out of the eating more sugar. Men get to eat 37 grams, which is just over 9 teaspoons. So if you think about it, 1 teaspoon is about 4 grams of sugar. Okay. And that's so roughly like 1 sugar cube, if you want to think about it that way, is roughly that 1 teaspoon. So thinking about that, I'm going to I want to make sure there's research that I want to share with you. So I want to make sure that I have it all here. Actually, some of the research just came through my computer over the last few days, and I was like, oh, this is perfect timing. Okay, so many times we really don't realize how much sugar we're eating, and estimates suggest that the average American consumes well over 100 pounds of sugar, and some estimates even put that at over 150 pounds of sugar per year. And like I said, some of this we don't even realize because it's hidden in these foods, right? So how much sugar is actually in some of our foods? Now, this is a little misleading because it's showing you the amount of sugar, natural sugar, as well as added sugar, and they're not really differentiating here. So I want to make sure that you know that there is a difference, not necessarily in terms of what your body does with it, but in terms of how it's processed and metabolized. So if I were to eat, say, the carrots or the pineapple, there's a lot of natural fiber, there's vitamins and minerals, there's a lot of extra things in those that make that sugar not as detrimental as, say, the Starburst, right? Which really is, there's no nutritive value. It's just empty calories, basically, in the form of sugar. So there was actually a meta-analysis done in 2019, and it concluded that consuming sugar-sweetened beverages put people at higher risk of depression. So basically what they found was that drinking just over a 12-ounce can of soda a day, okay, which was roughly for them about 45 grams. So maybe 1 can and maybe a third of another can, if you think about it, increased the risk of depression by 5%. Okay, now this was if they drank that just over a can daily. Drinking 2.5 cans of soda per day increased this risk even further, all the way up to a 25% increased risk. Okay, So you think about how many of our kids today are drinking 1, 2, 3, even 4 sodas a day. Okay. And one of the links that they have suggested as to why this is occurring is because of that link with sugar being inflammatory and inflammation now starting to be explored as a possible driver of that depression. And there is a video link. It just shows this sort of in a cute way. I'm not going to show it to you today, but it's definitely there if you want to access it. So this just really extends this idea of added sugar is not necessarily what we want to be doing, okay? So on average, if we think about it from the studies, we look at some of these things, ultra-processed food consumption in the US accounts for how much of a percentage of the calories do you think it accounts for? If you want to add it in the chat really quick. So ultra-processed food consumption in the US accounts for about what percentage of the calories consumed? Any ideas?
You have a guess of 50?
Okay. That's actually pretty close. It's just over about 55%, okay? In adolescence, if we look at that, that number has been increasing, and we know this. And estimates now suggest that approximately 2/3 of adolescent intake may come from these ultra-processed foods. Okay, and again, these foods promote inflammation and can damage that metabolic and neural signaling that helps control that hunger. All right. Now, I'm just going to throw this on you too. Remember when we were talking about CCK and I told you that ultra processed foods could alter the way that it signals the body that it's full, alter the expression of digestive enzymes, this and that. This is where these ultra processed foods come in, because it's the emulsifiers, such as specifically, if you want to look, if you've ever looked at the food label, polysorbate 80 or your carbamethylcellulose. Sometimes you'll see it as CMC. But those emulsifiers, along with the added sugars and the preservatives, actually alter the communication between the gut and the brain for these nutritive signals, these neural signals, as well as the chemical signals for what's going on. Okay, so that's really how that mechanism is starting to play. And so eating an unprocessed diet, right, one that doesn't have all these things, can actually help to repair this dysfunction. Okay, so if we look at these sodas and we look at different things, a lot of us are going to say, okay, well, we'll just do a sugar alternative, right? Well, what does the research really say about those sugar alternatives? Okay, so I wanted to make sure that I put this in there, and this is constantly changing. We get new research on this pretty consistently. But I can definitely send this out to you as well. If we're talking about sugar alternatives, typically there are several that the FDA recognizes as generally safe, okay, or this GRAS status, generally recognized as safe. However, what the research is showing is that for a lot of the specific artificial ones that are created in the lab, is that in many lab animals, they can cause cancer. Now, would that equate in humans? That question is still up in the air, but it has been shown in the lab animals. Okay, so things like your sulfame K, your aspartame, your saccharin, even your sucralose. And new research just published in 2020 from Dr. Dana Small's lab suggests that consumption of sucralose, okay, in combination with carbohydrate sources that increase that blood glucose, then pairs those two substances together. And then after that, even if we just ingest, say, that sucralose by itself, we will see an increase in the level of insulin being released, which can lead to that insulin insensitivity. So current thinking, based on this research is that if you're going to have a sugar sweetened or a artificially sweetened beverage, not to eat it with food, okay? To do it 2 to 4 hours before or after, because eating or drinking these artificial sweeteners with high caloric meals that raise your blood sugar too much, then pairs the two together and then allows the artificial sweetener to increase insulin on its own. Okay, so again, very new research, very hot off the press. And so there's still a lot of questions. Does it relate to other artificial sweeteners besides sucralose? What about stevia? What about monk fruit? Some of these more natural, does it do the same thing? Some of these things we just don't know. A lot of them, stevia, monk fruit, we think they're safe, at least in moderation, right? The only reason monk fruit has caution is because we haven't tested it as much. But the one caveat with stevia, because we're starting to see that a lot, I want to make sure that people understand, is that high amounts of stevia can actually impact your sex hormones. So women who are trying to get pregnant wouldn't necessarily want to have excessively high amounts of stevia in their diet because it could impact their ability. It impacts progesterone, is essentially what they're finding. Okay, so just to wrap up, because I know that we are out of time, but your brain on sugar. Sugar and ultra processed foods can impact your brain in many ways. Okay, we've talked about all these. They increase inflammation, they alter those hunger satiety cues and that neural circuitry. They impact the gut function. We will talk about that. They can alter the sleep patterns and they can increase your risk for neurodegenerative diseases and mood disruption. And in terms of depression, higher consumption of ultra processed foods significantly increase the risk of depression. And the study actually concluded, this was a study by Lane et al. Done in 2020. It was a systematic review and meta-analysis. And it concluded that ultra processed foods increase the risk of depression by up to 22 to 28%. Okay. So again, our key takeaways is that appetite is controlled by a complex mechanism, and things like stress and inflammation, nutrition, all of these things can play a role, right? And it's really the sugar and these ultra processed foods that can have a huge impact on these mechanisms and create those cravings and addictions by impairing that signaling. Okay, so what you eat not only impacts your gut, but it does impact your brain. So I will leave you with that. If anyone, I know some of you have to run, but if anyone can stay and you would like to have a time for questions, we can certainly field some of those at this point in time. I'm going to stop my share stuff and just kind of come back. Okay.
Amber, we did have one question in the chat. First of all, thank you for sharing that information. And it was regarding when you were talking about the meta-analysis with the sugary sodas, I believe. And someone had asked about drinks like Coke Zero or maybe like a Diet Coke or something like that. Did the study talk about those? I mean, I know you went into it a little bit in that in the sweetener slide.
They looked specifically, the study that I was referencing looked specifically at sucralose. So sucralose, and I'm not sure what Coke Zero uses. So I'm not sure, but if we think about sucralose, sucralose is typically what we find in Splenda. Okay, and that's what they specifically looked at. And so really more research needs to be done. We don't know if it's going to apply to all artificial sweeteners across the board, the same mechanism. It's certainly possible, but right now we just don't know. So
it looks like aspartame is the main sweetener in Coke Zero Sugar.
Okay, yeah, and aspartame has its own host of problems as well. So
the one other question was, we have someone who was diagnosed with insulin resistance a few years ago due to PCOS. They said, I crave sugar all the time because of it. Any ideas? I know we'll be getting into some tips and strategies on November 9th, but anything you want to share just as we wrap up today?
Well, let's see. So, insulin resistance, PCOS, and food cravings. Okay. Just thinking about it off the top of my head, we know that one of the main drivers of food cravings can be hormonal dysregulation, right? So thinking about how that would carry over, certainly there's a connection. I am not sure what exactly mechanism that would hit on. We've talked about several, and I'm just going to be honest, I'm not sure which one would be the main one, but I would definitely look into some of the articles that are starting to show, especially like stevia and how it can impact hormones. If you already have a hormonal imbalance, looking to see if that's going to be something that's going to be beneficial for you, or if that's something that might even exacerbate those conditions. And so kind of thinking about that, especially with regard to stevia. And what is considered a large amount of stevia? That's a good question. That is a good question. Typically, stevia is very, very small amounts, which is why they cut it. When we get the packets of stuff that have stevia in them, typically they're cut with something else because so little stevia is needed to actually get that sweet taste. But as far as an exact range, I have not seen that in terms of what would be excessive versus too little. So don't really know how to answer that one, except I can say when we talk about the pairing of these things, we're finding with ultra processed foods, sugars, the pairing of artificial sweeteners with high carb kinds of things, that it's impacting the neuronal signaling. And so anytime we're talking about dopamine, reward pathways, right? If you're wanting to kind of reset some of these pathways, just taking a break from all of them, you can start to see that sort of repair itself. Anywhere from, if we're talking about dopamine, a lot of people are suggesting like up to 28 days, taking time away from a substance. Other people, such as Mark Hyman from the Cleveland Clinic, he says that we can start to change it within as little as 10 days if we just cut out some of these things. So should we choose real sugar over these alternatives? I think that based on what we're finding is it's really about moderation. I mean, there's lots of eating patterns. If we look at paleo, right, they look at using natural forms of sugar, honey, different things, molasses, things like that. So we can find different alternatives, but the key, whether we're using these natural types of sweeteners or, even refined sugar versus artificial sweeteners, is really moderation. So, really using it as a once in a while reward, which can be really hard when we're eating all these ultra processed foods where they have these hidden sugars, but a lot of times we're getting these things without ever knowing that we're getting them. And that really seems to be part of that driving force.
All right. Any other questions? As always, I will be sending out an email following this presentation either later today or tomorrow. It will have the recording on it as well as Amber's contact information. So if you think of questions or if there's one that maybe you're not comfortable putting in the chat, you're welcome to contact Amber there. And Amber, I just want to say thank you for, again, starting the series with us and doing this. I think, something that you mentioned stuck with me, that it's not just as easy as just changing your thinking. And I think we're often fed those messages and we start to develop those self-defeating thoughts, especially when it comes to food, and how we regulate our mood with it. And going back to that diagram you showed, there's so many factors that that contribute to it. It's not just, oh, it's the way I think, I can change that, and it should happen for me. So I look forward to hearing the tips and strategies that you're going to share with us on the 9th. Again, we're going to be back here. It'll be the same link, but everyone will get a reminder from me as well. And then, like I said, sometime within the next 24 hours, you'll have the resources that Amber shared today. I think it was the assessment, the craving chart, some sugar alternatives, and the effect on the body. And then I'll also have in her contact information and the reminder link for the next session on the 9th. But this is something that, again, Amber alluded to it, but we're going to be talking again, just kind of laying the foundation over October and November. And then when we come back together in January, we're going to really be looking at that gut brain axis, the connection between the two, and start to really dive into the deeper part of the science of how resetting our body, changing our gut health can have an effect on our brain. So y'all stick around. And anything else, Amber, that I need to share that you have?
I think that's it. I'll make sure I get everything to you so we can send it all out. And yeah, thank you all for coming and staying a little longer.
Yes, thanks for sharing your time with us today, everybody. Have a good afternoon.